What makes a man a sophist is not his faculty, but his moral purpose. Historically, the idea of debate has been pretty controversial amongst philosophers. On the one hand, it can be an excellent way to hone ideas, challenge yourself and others, and perhaps learn something new. But, on the other, the realm of practical debate is chock full of dishonesty, fallacious reasoning, and outright slander. So, what are we to do? How should the honest thinker approach argument? Funnily enough, this is a problem that stretches right back to ancient Greece. Plato had argued that public debate was basically the realm of the sophist, and that real philosophy was done in private dialectical discussion. He scorned the democratic demagogues of Athens who had put Socrates to death, and argued that philosophy and rhetoric should, ideally, never touch. However, his pupil, Aristotle, took a more moderate approach. He wanted to turn rhetoric and debate into a school fit for good faith philosophical study. And luckily, we have access to his work on this very topic. Get ready to learn why philosophers should know the dirty tricks of debate, how we can avoid turning into sophists, and the difference between reasoned argument and emotional manipulation. But before any of that, I want to quickly thank our very kind sponsor for this video, Babbel. Babbel is a great language learning tool where you can study anything from Russian to Italian to Spanish in a natural, intuitive, and conversational fashion. At the moment, I'm trying to improve my French so I can read Camus in his original language. And while, bien sûr, non possible être certain, je pense que mon français est vraiment meilleur. The thing that separates Babbel from a lot of other language learning apps is its practical outlook. It structures lessons around sensible, useful topics like travel or business or relationships. Additionally, they have a 20-day money-back guarantee, so if you try it and you find it's not a good fit, you can write to them for a full refund. Click my link below to take Babbel's quiz and save up to 60% today. So, give it a go, start learning some languages. And thank you, my dear viewer, for watching this interlude the whole way through. 1. Why learn rhetoric? The first question on many people's minds when it comes to this topic is, why should we bother learning about rhetoric in the first place? And there are good reasons to be skeptical of this skill. Rhetoric is associated less with honest argumentation and the exploration of ideas, and much more with underhanded debate tactics and horrible manipulation. And this is, to a certain extent, a well-deserved reputation. Even in Aristotle's time, rhetorical skill had been used to convince the people of Athens to embark on a whole series of disastrous decisions during the recent Peloponnesian War. So there's a good precedent for fearing the realm of public debate and even saying it is outright dishonest. However, throughout this work, appropriately titled Rhetoric, Aristotle peppers in these reasons for why philosophers should take rhetoric seriously, even if they only consider it a necessary evil. The first is just that people are going to use rhetoric anyway. It is such a useful tool if you want to persuade someone to do something, or spread your belief system, or just win an argument over dinner. There is no chance it's going to up and vanish. It has been over 2,000 years since Plato wrote his damning condemnations of sophistry, and yet we have not turned into a society of perfectly reasonable agents simply putting forward logical arguments and seeing where the facts lie. As much as it pains me to say it, humans are simply not creatures of pure logic, and if good faith arguers run away from this fact, then they just guarantee that someone arguing in bad faith will almost always win out in the end. If we take this faux principled stance and avoid studying rhetoric, then it would be like refusing to stop using swords after the invention of the machine gun. Sure, we may have won some internal moral victory, but we're going to get mown down by hails of bullshit as a result. Aristotle also takes pains to show how rhetoric is not inherently dishonest. It is a tool that can be used by anyone for any end. He reiterates over and over again that the basis for any honest persuasion should still be the quality of the argumentation. We should be using sound and defensible arguments, but he says we cannot leave it there. We must recognize that people are not only persuaded by logic, but also by emotion and perceptions of character. We may not like it, but that is just how things are. We can either live in the world as it exists or pretend we live in a world that we wish would exist. It's just that living in an ideal world is, practically speaking, a recipe for disaster. We can think of an honest use of rhetoric as a bit like a cake. The logical arguments would form a high-quality dough baked to perfection. Very few cakes can taste their best without this element. But at the same time, if we're looking to sell a cake, we cannot stop there. We must then add some icing and decoration, consider the color scheme and the aesthetic of the cake, all while bearing in mind that this does not compromise the quality of the taste. then our well-made cake is more likely to be bought and enjoyed. This is worlds away from baking an atrocious cake and then trying to trick people into buying it by dolling it up as much as possible. In the first case, the outer quality is merely an honest reflection of the inner quality, while the appearance of the second attempts to sell us on an inner richness that simply does not exist. Additionally, Aristotle thinks that a philosophical treatment of persuasiveness is worthwhile in any case, because people are in fact persuaded by a myriad of different things, and this is interesting in and of itself. If we are to be critical of our own beliefs and the beliefs of others, then it is helpful to have an understanding of how we might have been persuaded, and the types of things that are more persuasive in general. If nothing else, learning the underhanded tactics of debaters will allow us to point out what they're doing, and hopefully lessen the effectiveness of these techniques if they're being used in service to a poor overall point. This is sort of characteristic of the kind of approach Aristotle brought to philosophy. Whereas, speaking incredibly loosely, Plato was very concerned with the ideal and striving towards this ideal, Aristotle was far more concerned about encountering the world as it exists and learning to navigate it in a practical and everyday fashion. While he would not have recognized the label, and he does differ from it in many ways, Aristotle's thinking has a far greater empiricist bent to it than Plato's. And this is evident in the practical and naturalistic way that he discusses rhetoric and persuasiveness. So if you find yourself at any point in this video thinking that these tactics seem a little bit deceptive or dubious, that is absolutely fine. The point is to take the honest ones and use them in service to an honest argument, while at the same time learning how to combat the dishonest ones. This is how Aristotle might distinguish a virtuous use of rhetoric from a viceful one. So, with that in mind, let's discuss the very foundation of Aristotle's rhetorical system, the way he builds a reasonable argument. 2. Reasons and persons. For Aristotle, the first pillar of good rhetoric is simply to have a defensible position. This is where the study of rhetoric crosses over both the internal and external spheres, because, of course, finding a defensible position is something that takes preparation and practice ahead of time, and is also an issue of straightforward epistemic responsibility. So, it is important to both understand the structure of your arguments and what separates a strong argument from a weak one. Obviously, this is a huge topic, and there's been an awful lot of thinking on this since Aristotle. But at the same time, he definitely has some useful pointers. I just want to preface this section by saying what Aristotle means here is hotly debated by scholars, and this is just my preferred interpretation mixed with some distinctions from modern logic. Just bear that in mind, because Aristotle himself almost certainly intended something slightly different to this. The first type of argument Aristotle looks at is called an enthymeme. This is a technical term from his philosophy, and is essentially an argument that is not deductively valid, but lends credence to its conclusion from its premises. There are other ways that Aristotle draws this distinction, but this is the one I'm going to be using for the sake of the video. We can look at this in contrast to a strictly deductive argument. For instance, 1. All men are mortal. 2. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a deductive syllogism. The conclusion follows from the premises with certainty. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then necessarily Socrates is mortal. But an enthymeme is slightly different. Their conclusions do not follow with certainty, but are instead a little bit more like giving evidence for a position. For instance, say I am advising against Athens going to war with Sparta. I might make the following case. 1. Sparta has a stronger army than us. 2. Stronger armies tend to win wars. Therefore, we should not go to war with Sparta. If this is analysed as a deductive argument, then it is obviously invalid. Nothing about the premises establishes with certainty that Athens should not go to war with Sparta. Nonetheless, someone having a stronger army than you is, on the face of it, a pretty good reason not to go to war with them. As a result, this is a fairly strong enthymeme. There is nothing wrong with the fact that it's not deductively valid, as long as we don't trick ourselves into thinking that the conclusion is certain. This is partly what makes the everyday arguments we find in the world so tricky to navigate. There are a whole bunch of premises underlying enthymemes that are often not explicitly expressed. For instance, in this case, we did not explicitly say that we should only really enter wars that we think we have a fair chance at winning, but that formed part of the background to the conversation. An enthymeme is going to be strong or weak just to the extent the premises lend credence to the conclusion. If we were being technical, we could probably spell this out explicitly with some Bayesian mathematics, but instead let's just do a straightforward example. Imagine that you were a doctor in charge of diagnosing a patient. You might first notice that they have a cough, and then come up with the loose hypothesis that they have the flu. You might then spot that they have a fever, and the extent to which the conclusion is supported would rise a little bit. Next, you might discover they have aching joints, and the enthymeme supporting the flu hypothesis gets stronger and stronger. This would be an example of what Aristotle calls an enthymeme of signs. You have a set of facts, each of which loosely points towards a particular conclusion, but taken together, they form a very compelling reason for believing that conclusion. So the overall message for creating strong enthymemes is simple, but very effective. Ensure that the totality of evidence lends more credence to your view than to your opponent's, and that the evidence you raise is not non sequitur to your conclusion. I also want to point out here that Aristotle draws lots of distinctions between different types of enthymeme based on their form, but unfortunately I can't go into them all here. Next, Aristotle talks about the use of examples in reasoning. For Aristotle, examples seem to have two main uses. The first is simply illustrative. Sometimes an example can help elucidate what you mean in a more efficient way than simply stating your point outright. For instance, if I wanted to illustrate the stakes of making poor tactical decisions, I might invoke the example of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. This might not necessarily support whatever point I was trying to make, but it does communicate a whole host of associations to do with arrogance and the underestimation of foes that I then don't have to meticulously explain one by one. On the other hand, a series of examples can certainly lend support to a conclusion, provided that there is relevant similarity between the examples raised and the situation being discussed. For example, over the past 2 centuries, it has become incredibly fashionable to compare current events to those leading up to the fall of Rome. However, the persuasiveness of this comparison rests on how genuinely similar the situations are in relevant ways. Without this, the example may be emotively compelling, but it doesn't logically support the overall point being made. There's an overarching theme here to Aristotle's discussion that's worth bringing out. When we are dealing with arguments that are non-deductive, it is not simply a matter of whether the argument is valid or sound or fallacious. Instead, we must consider the relative credence lent by a particular set of premises to a particular conclusion, and then compare that to the opposite conclusion. It is entirely possible that we could have 2 equally strong enthymemes pointing to contrary conclusions. In the Peloponnesian War, Sparta did have a larger army than Athens, but Athens had naval superiority. In this case, genuine uncertainty could arise over what should be done. The evidence for and against Athens going to war with Sparta might be weighted pretty evenly. In a roundabout way, Aristotle's discussion of practical debate does instill a certain sense of epistemic humility in the reader. It can genuinely arise that the enthymemes for one position are just as strong as for another. This also ties into a broader point of how to be a good faith debater. For Aristotle, outlining one's enthymemes and examples clearly and precisely will both help bring out their strengths if they are genuinely powerful, and expose their weaknesses if they are poor quality. So, if you are confident that you are correct, but also open to being proven wrong, then it makes sense to wear your arguments on your sleeve in this fashion. However, apart from perhaps a few technical points, you probably already knew a lot of this. The really juicy part of Aristotle's account is how we can best present our arguments to be most persuasive. And the first step is understanding the emotional components to belief formation. 3. I've got a feeling, woo-hoo. For me, the most interesting contribution Aristotle makes in his whole study of rhetoric is probably in his approach to emotions, and specifically how he suggests the rhetorician could use them to advantage. This information is phenomenally useful, both if you're an honest debater just trying to stir the appropriate emotion in an audience, but also to spot when dishonest actors use this to manipulate a crowd. I cannot give a full treatment of Aristotle's view of emotions here because he's incredibly detailed, but I will cover his main points and give you an idea of his general approach. First, Aristotle talks of anger and calmness. He defines anger as the wish to take revenge and says it stems from a perception that one has been wronged or insulted, while calmness is just left to mean a general lack of anger or a sense that things are broadly as they should be. If anger can spur people onto action, then calm instead promotes a gentle passivity. The utility for the orator here makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to get people to act, especially in a vengeful fashion, then it would be very useful to make them feel incredibly angry. And specifically, Aristotle says anger is best provoked by a sense of injustice. If you convince someone that they have been genuinely wronged, then they will be understandably furious. Again, this can be used in an honest or dishonest fashion. On the one hand, if there truly is a cause of anger because of a severe injustice, then it's arguably only appropriate that an audience be encouraged to feel angry. Imagine that I was giving a speech to a group of people who had just had their savings stolen by a mastermind conman. But all I did was outline exactly what had been lost in boring and technical fashion. Arguably, by leaving out the crucial fact that an injustice had been committed, I would be obscuring the truth rather than promoting it. Here, the more honest thing to do might be to let the crowd know they can be angry. On the other hand, the same skills could easily be used to stoke an unjust sense of aggrievement. Of course, this in turn will depend on whatever ethical theory you're using. Next, Aristotle talks about fear. He describes fear as a feeling of pain that arises when danger is nearby. And again, this is a stimulant to action, either to eliminate the threat or to escape it. And sometimes this only seems appropriate. Someone could arouse fear in their audience specifically so they might treat a coming disaster with the appropriate level of severity. But also, someone else might whip a crowd into a terror-fueled frenzy just so that they can later present themselves as the savior that delivered them from this imaginary danger. By contrast, if you wanted to discourage hasty decision-making, it is helpful to instill a sense of confidence in the audience, to reassure them that there is no major threat. This, just like calmness, is a more passive and deliberative state. After this, he moves on to discussing friendship and hostility. Friendship is defined as wishing the good of the other for their own sake, while hostility is essentially the opposite, wishing someone harm for the very sake of that person's suffering. Though Aristotle treats friendship in more detail in his other works, he says that friendliness is engendered when we get the idea that someone wants the best for us, or in some way shares our interests. Intuitively, that they are on our team, while hostility is just begotten by the opposite. It's pretty vital that whoever you're trying to convince views you in friendly terms. You must ensure that they know that you have their best interests at heart, are being truthful and are only trying to help. This is one area where the honest debater actually has an advantage. If you are just lying or manipulating to get your way, there is always a chance that that will be found out, and this is likely to reveal that you are a hostile element to whoever you're trying to sway. Whereas, at the very least, someone acting in good faith will be able to produce convincing evidence for that fact. These emotions can also be fired up against or in favor of others, depending on what your goals are. Again, it's largely a matter of convincing someone that some third party either wishes them well or wishes them ill, and this will largely dictate whether they feel friendly or hostile towards them. This too can be done honestly or dishonestly. Maybe someone genuinely does wish them well or genuinely does wish them ill. But at the same time, it's very easy to sow hostility for nefarious ends. Aristotle has a number of other emotions that he analyzes, but I want to turn to his general approach. First, he notices what each particular emotion would do for the orator. In the case of anger, it promotes vengeful action. Fear promotes vigilance and retreat. Friendliness promotes trust and receptiveness. He will then provide a causal story for what tends to bring each one about. Injustices in the case of anger, danger in the case of fear, and shared goodwill in the case of friendliness. This then creates a natural set of instructions for the orator. If you want to bring about anger, then you must convince someone that there is injustice. And if you want to promote friendliness, then you must convince them of either your goodwill or the goodwill of some third party, and so on. But there's also a wider point here. For Aristotle, a good rhetorician is not just someone who is logically adept, but emotionally skilled. The orator must have a highly developed sense of empathy in order to track the emotions of the audience or conversational partner and move in tandem with them. But again, this is a double-edged sword. Just as emotional intelligence can be used to understand and respond, it can also be used to manipulate. And in order to stir emotions and present arguments effectively, we must also learn the ins and outs of the audience themselves. And this is where Aristotle's next point comes into play. 4. Knowing me, knowing you. Aha. Philosophers can have this general tendency to conceive of themselves and others as totally disinterested parties, floating above the world and able to judge everything objectively. There is this general sense that the logic that works on the goose will also suffice for the gander, and that altering an argument or presentation for a particular audience will only obscure the logic at play. But Aristotle firmly disagrees. In keeping with his naturalistic views on humanity more generally, he knows that with different circumstances come different prejudices, biases, and more, and that this is worth bearing in mind if you are a speaker. At the most basic level, it is worth being aware of where you and your audience already agree. In the presentation of an argument in public, some premises will inevitably be glossed over for clarity and brevity. You won't be able to argue for every particular premise you're putting forward because you'll just run out of time. And if you want to convince someone of a particular view, it is worth starting from what they already believe and working from there. So, if you're giving a speech to a room full of vegetarians, you're probably pretty safe to invoke the suffering of animals as a premise in your argument. On the other hand, if you're speaking at a conference for devout scholastic Catholics, you would not be wise to eschew materialism at the outset of your point. If you do want to invoke such a stance, it will be a very difficult uphill battle to have it accepted as a premise of the discussion. Equally, if you're trying to refute an opponent's position using what Aristotle calls a refutational enthymeme, It is also worth starting from points they already agree with. At its best, this will allow you to make a reductio ad absurdum argument, where you begin with your opponent's beliefs and then show how they are either outright contradictory or just in severe tension. But none of this can be achieved if you set off with the wrong idea of what the people you are talking to already believe. Additionally, this is another vote in favor of good faith arguing. If you are genuinely curious about what someone thinks, then you'll be able to challenge what they actually believe, rather than some bizarre straw man. Straw manning might work in the short term if you don't mind using it, but people will eventually catch on. But separate to these more formal concerns, an audience's preconceived biases will also affect their particular emotional stances. You may think it is appropriate to stir them up into anger, and this, as we've just said, will involve giving them a sense of injustice. But this is not much help if you don't know what will actually provoke such a sense in your particular audience. Additionally, it may be that your listeners are simply not easily provoked into this feeling. Say they consisted entirely of Buddhist monks. If you've already considered this, then you'll likely choose a different tactic entirely. But if you haven't, then you'll just plow on ahead, likely without much effect. Aristotle also asks us to consider things like the age and social status of our audience. For him, younger people tend to be more interested in the future, while older people are more concerned with preserving what is best from the past. Those who are, broadly speaking, doing quite well out of society will be less open to changing it, whereas those who have not got a lot to lose are going to be much more receptive to radical shifts. He thinks that recent success is likely to bring overconfidence, while the opposite will hold for recent failure. I can't go through everything he says here, and a lot of it probably won't hold for the modern day, but the general lesson is quite instructive. For Aristotle, it is part of the orator's job to get to know the human mind in an intimate fashion for themselves, and to know exactly who they are trying to convince. It may even be worth us creating a sort of fictional avatar to stand in for the people we're trying to reach. Who are we trying to talk to? What do they already believe? What are their fears, values, and interests? Where are their biases or blind spots? We all have them. Again, this can be taken in both a positive and a negative direction. It's entirely possible to play on someone's biases so they take a course of action that only appears to be in their best interests, but in fact does the opposite. But if we're acting in good faith, then it can also make a sensible position salient in a way that speaks specifically to the audience. And if what we're saying is true, or we are genuinely acting in their best interests, then surely we want to make it salient so that they follow our advice or are convinced of our position. It's sort of the Spider-Man school of using rhetoric. With great persuasive power comes great responsibility. But lastly, Aristotle has some brilliant miscellaneous tips for arguing that don't fall into one neat, distinct category, but are nonetheless fantastic for general oratorical skill. 5. A touch of style. Finally, Aristotle examines how to best present an argument in practice, and he has a whole series of strategies to engender a sense of respect and receptiveness in your audience. The first is to balance clarity with eloquence. On the one hand, a touch of poetic language can perk up someone's ears and encourage them to pay attention. It's also a subtle signal to an audience that you generally know what you're talking about. But if you use too much, it is easy to come across as excessively verbose and basically a bit of a bullshitter. So for Aristotle, poetic language should only be used sparingly and where it has the greatest possible impact. Another strategy is to employ metaphors and similes to communicate a whole set of associations clearly and concisely. To take a modern example, if I say someone is a bit like Ross from Friends, most people have a pretty good idea of the kind of person I mean, without me having to spell it out. Likewise, if I refer to someone as the Einstein of the philosophy department, then that communicates a whole swathe of rich information incredibly efficiently. Similarly, Aristotle encourages speakers to use everything in their power to make ideas not just clear, but vivid. A brilliant instance of this is found in the brothers Karamazov. Alyosha and Ivan are having a discussion about the problem of evil, and to hammer his idea home, Ivan tells a story of an innocent young boy getting mauled by a pack of hunting dogs. This goes beyond making the problem of evil logically clear and creates an impactful image to go along with it. This is part of what gives Alyosha pause for thought in the conversation. This use of vividity can also help if your opponent is employing euphemisms. It is much easier to deal with evil if we imagine it in the abstract than if we are examining particular shocking instances of it. But since evil in the abstract is made up of these shocking examples, arguably not to deal with them would be missing the point. Aristotle also says that at all times we should consider the scope of both our argument and our opponent's. If we are merely talking probabilistically, then single counterexamples are often logically irrelevant. Indeed, they may even strengthen your opponent's position if they're so convoluted or obscure that they become the exception that proves the rule. These single examples can be used to illustrate points, or as part of a larger, more comprehensive survey, or to refute absolute certainty. But by themselves, their utility is pretty limited unless you're in a deductive context. If you do raise a counterexample, then it is worth explaining why the situation at hand is much more similar to your counterexample than to the general trend drawn upon by your opponent. For Aristotle, the careful use of emphasis is also of vital utility. Amplifying your strongest and most relevant points helps highlight exactly what in your argument an audience ought to hold on to and process. An awful lot of details of a speech will be forgotten almost immediately, so this will ensure that the vital components of your argument are remembered and retained. If at all possible, he thinks it is worth constructing your argument so that your audience concludes at the same time you do, or around that point. This way, they are not simply being told an argument, but instead they are coming to their own thoughts about the issue, which just so happen to be the same as yours because of the reasons that you've given. It is so much more pleasant to discover something for yourself than to be lectured at, and this helps an audience be much more sympathetic to your position. Lastly, we can bear in mind Aristotle's general theory of learning here, and recognize that being persuasive, like most other skills, cannot just be practiced in the abstract. By going out and having discussions and testing different strategies, we will slowly refine our skills, learning to spot gaps in our own thinking and that of others. Above all, we can turn our rhetorical devices back on ourselves to see how our own mind works. Where do our biases manifest? Where do we not recognize the structure of our own arguments? And where are we led astray by our own disposition towards anger or fear or friendliness or hostility? Personally, I think a wonderful reason to study the art of persuasion is to get a better idea of how we ourselves are persuaded. Thus, we can use Aristotle to strive towards that most Socratic of ideals, knowing ourselves. And a good place to start is to discover the fallacious or underhanded tactics that might be used to twist our wills against ourselves. So click here to learn about just that. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.